vanishing sea. Deep in the heart of Central Asia, where a massive sea once shimmered, lies a graveyard of salt and rust. This is the Aral Sea, or what is left of it. Decades ago, the Soviet government began diverting the rivers that fed this basin, effectively strangling the sea to hide what lay in its center. As the water receded it left behind a landscape of bleached shipwrecks, tilted at impossible angles in the poisoned sand. The sea was meant to be a moat, a natural barrier of brine and isolation, designed to keep the Kremlin's most dangerous secrets from ever reaching the mainland. But the water is gone, and the moat has turned into a desert. Aralsk 7, the erasure, on old Soviet military maps. There was a patch of land known as Vozrozhdeniya. The name ironically means rebirth. But in the classified ledgers of the biopreparat program, it was known simply as Aralsk 7. For 40 years, it was a ghost on the map, a fortress of biological terror hidden behind a curtain of state secrets. The island was so restricted that even Soviet pilots were ordered to fly hundreds of miles around it, fearing that a stray engine stall could drop them into the most infectious place on Earth. Now, the island is no longer a cage. It has become a land bridge, and the nightmares buried in its soil are starting to walk toward the world of the living. Kantubek, the city of the damned. In the center of the island stood Kantubek, a purpose-built city that housed 1,500 people, scientists, soldiers, and their families. It was a Soviet utopia in a wasteland, featuring schools, flower-lined parks, and even a social club. But this was a city living on a powder keg. Children played on swing sets while just a few hundred meters away, technicians in heavy, layered rubber suits worked with anthrax and weaponized plague. The families were told they were safe, but they lived with a permanent, low-level fear. They attended emergency drills, where gas masks were as common as school books, and they learned to never ever ask what was being stored in the windowless concrete bunkers nearby. The machinery of the invisible fire. The most terrifying aspect of the island was the testing range. Every morning, hundreds of monkeys, sheep, and dogs were brought to the center of the island and tethered to metal poles. From specialized towers, observers watched as aerosolized clouds of tularemia and smallpox were released into the wind. They weren't testing on paper. They were measuring the speed of death in real time. Scientists in lead-shielded goggles recorded how long it took for the invisible mist to take hold, watching through binoculars as the animals withered in the heat. This was the open-air trial, a place where the wind was weaponized, and nature itself was turned into an executioner, the domestic nightmare of Kantubek. While the testing grounds were a theater of biological death, the city of Kantubek was a masterclass in Soviet denial. Imagine a town where children played tag in the shadow of chimneys that exhaled weaponized anthrax into the morning fog. The residents lived in neat, brutalist apartment blocks. They shopped at well-stocked markets and watched the latest movies at the local cinema, pretending the island was a paradise. But there was one rule everyone followed. The windows were never, ever opened. Every morning, mothers would take a damp cloth and wipe a strange, fine gray dust from the windowsills. It was the dust that didn't come from the desert sand. It came from the laboratories. They were told it was harmless residue from industrial filters, but they knew better. They knew to never let their children touch it with their bare hands. In Kantubek, you didn't fear the military police. You feared a shift in the wind. Engineering the invisible killers. The diseases born in those sterile labs weren't the ones you find in medical textbooks. The scientists at Aralsk 7 were tasked with a singular dark goal: to take nature's most effective killers and make them absolute. They took Anthrax 836, a strain so aggressive that a single microscopic spore inhaled into the lungs was a terminal sentence. Once inside the warm environment of the body, the spores would germinate, releasing toxins that literally liquefied the internal organs from the inside out. It turned the lungs into a dark, bloody soup in a matter of days. They perfected a version of the bubonic plague that was engineered to be resistant to every known antibiotic in the Western world. And then there was tularemia, modified to survive in an aerosolized cloud for hours, capable of incapacitating an entire military division with a single invisible breath. These weren't just viruses. They were high-precision military hardware designed to turn the human body into a prison of agony. The observation wards, the disposable humans deep inside the restricted sectors, in the windowless bunkers of Building 201, a different class of person existed. These were the technicians of the hot zone, men and women who lived and worked in heavy multi-layered rubber suits. Inside those suits, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of oxygen lines, a sound that reminded them every second that the air they were walking through was a death sentence. They handled vials of the Black Death with thick, clumsy gloves, knowing that a single microscopic tear or a single failed seal meant they would never leave the island alive. If an accident happened, there were no doctors to save them. They were simply moved to the observation wards, where their own colleagues would watch them die through 3 inches of reinforced glass. They would take notes on the speed of the hemorrhaging, the failure of the nervous system, and the final desperate gasps for air, recording every detail as valuable data for the state. On Aralsk 7, human life was just another expendable resource in the pursuit of the perfect weapon. The Lev Berg incident and the KGB silence. In the summer of 1971, the glass barrier finally shattered for the world outside. A research vessel, the Lev Berg, was navigating the Aral Sea, unaware that a secret, open-air test of weaponized smallpox was underway on the island. A calculation error in the wind speed, and a localized cloud of the virus drifted directly over the ship. A young female technician on deck breathed it in, a single invisible terminal breath. When she reached the city of Aralsk, the fever took hold, and the invisible fire began to spread through the streets. The Soviet response was swift and terrifyingly silent. The KGB moved in, walling off entire city blocks with barbed wire and armed guards. The dead were buried in mass graves, deep pits filled with quicklime to dissolve the bodies and the virus together, leaving no trace of the Kremlin's failure. The secret was contained, but the poison remained, sleeping in the salt and waiting for the sea to disappear. The Saiga Massacre. By the late 1980s, the invisible fire of Aralsk 7 was no longer contained within the laboratories or the island's borders. In May 1988, on the nearby Turgai steppe, a nightmare unfolded that the local hunters still speak of in whispers. Nearly 50,000 saiga antelopes, a massive, healthy herd, dropped dead in the span of a single hour. They weren't hunted, and they showed no signs of starvation. They simply stopped breathing. Witnesses described the animals walking in circles, their eyes clouded with a milky film, before collapsing in heaps across the cracked earth. The official Soviet reports blamed natural causes and pasteurellosis, but the hunters knew better. They had seen the silver planes flying low over the island that morning, trailing thin white plumes that vanished into the wind. They knew that when the air smelled of metallic rot, the earth itself was dying. The stainless steel graves. As the Soviet Union began its final chaotic collapse in the early 90s, a wave of panic hit the military command at Aralsk 7. They were sitting on the world's largest stockpile of weaponized Anthrax 836, nearly 200 tons of a pathogen so concentrated it could have extinguished human life across the entire continent. They couldn't burn it, and they couldn't take it with them. Their solution was as primitive as it was terrifying. They packed the sludge into massive, heavy-duty stainless steel canisters, containers the size of a man, and shipped them to the most remote corner of the island. There they dug deep trenches in the white sand and buried the canisters by the dozens. They poured hundreds of gallons of concentrated bleach over the metal to neutralize any leaks, covered them with a thin layer of dirt, and hoped the desert would swallow the evidence of their crimes forever. The survivor, Anthrax 836, but the scientists in Moscow had made a fatal calculation. They had engineered Anthrax 836 to be the ultimate survivor, a strain designed to endure the extreme heat of a missile launch and the freezing cold of the upper atmosphere. It was never meant to die in a shallow grave. Anthrax spores are not like other bacteria. They are biological time capsules. They can lay dormant in the soil for a century, encased in a protective shell that resists bleach, salt, and time itself. As the decades passed, the Aral Sea continued to disappear, and the groundwater beneath the island began to rise. The bleach washed away, and the salt in the soil began to eat through the stainless steel of the canisters. The graves were no longer sealed. The island was breathing again, and what it was exhaling was a pathogen that had been sleeping and waiting for its chance to return. The Great Abandonment. In 1992, the orders came to evacuate Kantubek in 48 hours. It wasn't a planned withdrawal, it was a flight of terror. Families were forced to leave behind everything they owned: their clothes, their furniture, and their children's toys. They left the schools with books still open on the desks, and the laboratories with half-filled vials sitting on the counters. The military didn't stay to clean up. They simply cut the power, locked the main gates, and left Aralsk 7 to the desert wind. They left behind a city of ghosts and a landscape saturated with 100 years of biological warfare. For years, the island sat in total silence, a ticking clock in the middle of a vanishing sea, waiting for the water to recede far enough for the world to reach it again. The vanishing moat. By the early 2000s, the geography of the Aral Sea had fundamentally changed. The water, which once served as a deep, salty moat for Aralsk 7, had receded so far that Vozrozhdeniya was no longer an island. It had become a peninsula, a direct land bridge connected to the mainland of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. This was the most dangerous geographic shift in human history. The natural barrier that kept the world's most lethal pathogens contained was gone. Now there was nothing but a flat, cracked desert of salt and toxic dust, separating the Anthrax Pits from populated cities. The cage had been opened by the desert itself, and the predators inside didn't need to swim anymore. They could simply walk. The biological travelers. The greatest threat on the island today isn't the rusted labs, it's the wildlife. Rats, ground squirrels, and foxes have made their homes inside the ruins of Kantubek and Building 201. They burrow into the soil, through the bleached layers of sand, and come into contact with the leaking canisters of anthrax and plague. Pathogens that were meant to be buried forever are now hitching a ride in the fur and blood of these animals. As these creatures move across the land bridge toward the mainland, they carry the invisible fire with them. One infected rodent reaching a grain silo or a local farm is all it takes to restart the nightmare the Soviets tried to bury. The island is no longer a restricted zone. It is a ticking biological bomb that is slowly, quietly migrating toward civilization. The scavenger's curse. Despite the warnings and the lingering smell of ozone and rot, the scavengers have come. Driven by poverty, local men sneak past the rusted fences to dig for scrap metal. They target the high-quality stainless steel and copper abandoned in the laboratories and the underground bunkers. They handle the metal with their bare hands, unaware that the surfaces are still saturated with decades of concentrated biological agents. They take the metal back to their villages to sell, but they bring back something else as well. In the villages surrounding the Aral Desert, doctors speak of a scavenger's curse. Men who enter the island return with strange, purple bruises, a sudden high fever, and lungs that begin to fill with fluid in the middle of the night. They die in silence, their deaths officially blamed on the flu or pneumonia. But the truth is buried as deeply as the canisters on the island. The eternal legacy. Vozrozhdeniya Island is a monument to a superpower that played God and lost. The labs are empty, the ships are rusted husks, and the Soviet Union is a ghost of the past. But its most dangerous children are still alive. The pathogens are patient. They do not care about borders or treaties. They are simply waiting for the wind to shift, or for a curious hand to open the wrong door. The Aral Sea is a desert now, a white wasteland that hides a legacy of fire beneath its salt. This has been Russian dark stories. The past is never truly dead. It is just waiting for the next generation to uncover it. If you ever find yourself on the shores of a sea that no longer exists, listen to the wind. It might be carrying the last secret of the Kremlin. Sleep well, if you can.